Hey everyone, so this last year has been all about my smaller game Bloom Labyrinth, and we released that last week. But now with Labyrinth out of the way, I think the best thing to do is to finally start the push to finish up the larger RPG, Bloom Memories. I also figured this would be a good chance to go over what I've done with Memories. Everything from how I made the assets to how I thought about the various details, and just generally why I did what I did. This next stretch is also going to be pretty fun, as now all the pieces are finally coming together. So look forward to progress updates and more videos like this. Hopefully you find it at least a little bit interesting. Anyhow, let's talk about how I approach the world and maps. Obviously, I'd already decided what type of game I wanted to make. An RPG-ish like the original Zelda. At least that's where I started. So of course, I began by looking closer at that inspiration. I noticed their world was divided into larger themed sections, forest areas, rocky areas, desert areas, and so on. Not just Zelda, but other RPGs were also doing it to keep the game varied enough to stay visually interesting. You even see this outside of games, like movies use color during their storyboarding stage, choosing overall tones as the movie advances through the runtime to keep things interesting and even communicate with. Eventually, I felt I had enough information, so I sat down and I began loosely painting in general colors, thinking about what the areas could eventually become later on. Green for forest, yellowish for the desert, red for rocky mountains, blue for water. It all came together in a loose way pretty easily. It's also worth noting that around this time, I had decided to take on the traditional Zelda method for handling rooms, a single screen for a single room. As kind of a personal challenge to try and see how far I could take such an old, clunky world presentation. And the old map method even had an advantage, as this type of room management was pretty straightforward and made it easier to chart out a world space. So I went ahead and created a grid on top of the rough color areas, and slowly thought through the flow of the game, where the winding paths would go, backtrack spots, choke points for progression to keep the players from skipping important story or unlocks, and dungeons. Of course, dungeons. One for each major section. Sure, I didn't know why the player would be going to these places, but I figured I could work that out later. Anyhow, with the first version of the map roughly thought out, eventually it came time to dig in and start making the actual backgrounds. The game was always planned to be purely 2D in the engine, so this gave me a lot of freedom to play around with how I made them. At first, I started with a small section of the forest where I imagined the players would wake up. Even if it would eventually be redone as the art style advanced, it was a pretty good starting point. To make the ground, I simply used a few different ground images, and I'd mask in details, creating a unique base for each screen, then applied shading and shadows on top. And the trees were first 3D renders I had done, though didn't look quite right, and I replaced them eventually with real ones. After that, I did a pre-forest area, which eventually became the Kickstarter demo, as I was forming the story in my head. Then, after the Kickstarter, it was time to really get to work. So I sat down and kept thinking through the map, adding new areas, and over years doing the art for each. I also tried to consider the gimmick each area would have and how the gameplay would change and keep players interested. The way I actually created the maps changed with each area, but overall the goal was generally the same. A wide, open, central area with some type of framing. For the forest, treetops made for easy framing with a little experimentation. The deserts ended up without much foreground framing, but it seemed to work okay. The mountain area, I did rocks and some more trees. And the water area was probably the most difficult, with an awkward mini mountain framing through the central islands. And finally, the dark forest I framed with some more detailed mossy rocks. Every now and then, I'd also make a few extra rooms that didn't necessarily fit into the main map. These were meant to be discoveries and secrets as special events, which also gave me a chance to play around with some other scenery. So obsidian walls, basalt columns, beach rocks, it helped break up the monotony of creating the world maps, and hopefully bring a bit more spice to the game. Generally, that's how I approach the overworld. Nothing that complicated. Just slowly working down through the levels of detail, like you do making a drawing. Start off with a loose sketch, then work on the larger forms, and eventually dig down through the nitty-gritty details, adjusting things as you go. Along the way, I was always thinking about the experience of the players and keeping the path they would travel interesting. while also creating a large enough space for discovery and secrets to hide. Overall, I think it came together pretty well, and as I was making them, I was also working on the creatures that would live there. But that's a subject for another video. Anyhow, if you like what I'm doing and want to help me finish up, feel free to check out the links in the description, and be sure to subscribe for more videos.